If you're watching this video, you're probably thinking of learning many languages simultaneously, or you might be doing that already. In either case, you have landed on the right place. The aim of this video is to provide a comprehensive guide on how to learn many languages at the same time. To this end, I've watched the content that fellow polyglots and language teachers have created on this topic and merged the most interesting insights I have found with my own opinions. It will be structured as follows. Firstly, I will lay out the 3 conditions I think you should meet if you want to learn many languages simultaneously, and then I will explain the 6 rules I believe you should abide by when going about this. The most important condition you should fulfill is probably the following. You have already learned one foreign language successfully. This is something both Hugo and Luca Lampariello claim, and I deem it to be a sensible piece of advice. Learning a foreign language is a difficult task, not to mention learning 2 languages at the same time. So the more experience you have as a language learner, the larger your likelihood of succeeding at it. With some degree of experience, you are less likely to, for instance, make basic mistakes. That happens to all of us, especially when we are starting out. Making these errors will slow down our learning and demotivate us. But the more we have dealt with foreign languages, the more likely we are to have gone through these mistakes, to have learned from them, and thus the more likely we are to avoid them. Also, if you have some language learning experience, you will know yourself better. You'll know what your weaknesses are, be it grammar, vocabulary, or speaking, and you can pay close attention to them from the very beginning, which again has a positive effect on your learning speed. And to top it off, if you have already learned one foreign tongue successfully, you'll have more language learning confidence. That is, since you have already achieved a very good level in one language, you know that you can make it. Setbacks will not affect you that much. They are less likely to make you think that you'll never manage to learn that language. This confidence will give you some very needed doses of perseverance when self-doubt and self-sabotage arise. And as I said in my last video, stamina is important if you want to embark on a language learning marathon. But perseverance does not only depend on your level of language learning confidence. It is also very tied to discipline. If you show up every day to do the work, no matter what, regardless of how much progress you're making or on how you feel on that day, then you're more likely to keep on learning even when self-doubt arises. Thus, a second feature you should have if you want to learn many languages simultaneously is the necessary consistency to perform every day. In fact, all YouTube polyglots work on their languages on a daily basis. Doing this will help you make progress continually, which again will boost your motivation. If you combine this trait with the language learning confidence I just mentioned, then you're stacking the odds of success in your favor. Finally, not only should you work on your languages every day, you should also have a decent amount of time available on a daily basis. If you want to master a foreign tongue, it will not be enough to just practice 10 minutes on the commute and 10 minutes before going to sleep. I guess we can all agree that we need 25 to 30 minutes to have a productive session and make some progress, although we would obviously move forward even quicker if we had 40 minutes or 1 hour or even more. For the sake of the argument, let's assume you should devote 40 minutes per language per day in order to move forward and not feel stuck. In that case, and assuming you just want to learn 2 languages at the same time, then you'd have to devote 1.5 hours per day to language learning. And if your goal is to learn 3 languages at the same time, then 2.5 hours would probably be a sensible minimum. So before you embark on this multiple language learning adventure, you should consider this aspect. Do you really have the necessary time available per day? If not, then I and Luca would advise against it. The reason, again, boils down to the rate of progress you make. If you feel stuck in one of the languages and if it happens to be a difficult one for you, then you're more likely to abandon it. So, if you have already learned a foreign language successfully, if you have the consistency, and if you have the necessary time available every day, and you decide that you want to learn many languages simultaneously, well then probably you shouldn't do more than 2 at the same time. In one of his videos, Luca Lampariello explains how he managed to learn so many languages. In essence, he focused on 2 languages simultaneously for 2 years before switching to new tongues. In that same video, he claims that he never learns more than 2 languages at the same time. I think this makes sense because doing otherwise would imply too big of a daily commitment. As I previously mentioned, learning 3 tongues simultaneously would mean that you'd have to devote more than 2 hours of focused learning per day. Learning 4 or 5 languages at the same time would mean investing more than 3 hours per day, and all that would be inconceivable for most of us. My second piece of advice is that you should not study 2 languages that are similar to each other. The problems that might emerge when doing that are diverse. Maybe the most conspicuous one is that you mix up words in both languages because they are very similar. Let's say that you're learning Spanish and Portuguese. In that case, you might mix up the word for journey. In Spanish it would be el viaje, and in Portuguese, a viagem. Well, I'm not sure about the pronunciation, I don't speak Portuguese yet, but I think you got the idea. You might also confuse the genders of the words in case they are not the same. In the example I just gave you, for instance, one of the words is masculine and the other one is feminine. On top of that, some grammar concepts and verb conjugations are likely to blur. For example, if you're learning French and Italian and you're trying to master the subjunctive mood, it might get messy because they are slightly different. It can be confusing even if you're not learning the languages simultaneously, I can tell you from experience. So don't make it more chaotic by learning similar tongues at the same time. But not only should the languages you choose be different among themselves, Luca claims that you should also try to choose a difficult language and an easy one, namely one that is relatively close to your mother tongue and one that is far from it. Let's illustrate this with an example. If you're Italian, then instead of studying Farsi and Hebrew, one being an Indo-Iranian language, the other being Northwest Semitic, you could learn Portuguese and Chinese at the same time, because Portuguese is a Romance language like Italian. And by the way, this is what Luca Lampariello did. I think this makes sense for two reasons. Firstly, because it does not make language learning exhausting. Think of it, if you had to tackle two very difficult languages at once, your study session would become very demanding. It would be tiresome and progress in one of the tongues would be difficult, because your energies would probably be drained towards the end of the session. Secondly, you're more likely to make tangible progress. If you're dealing with a language that is relatively easy for you, you'll certainly advance at a quicker rate. Maybe you can even start speaking within a few months. This is essential for your motivation. It will increase your willingness to keep working hard on it. The next piece of advice is also aimed at making your study session less exhausting. And this can be done by learning languages that are at different levels. If you do this, the type of activities you are going to engage with in each of the languages are going to be different. For instance, with the language that you speak at a very basic level, you're going to focus a lot on, for instance, learning basic words, on understanding the grammar, and you might even have to learn a new alphabet. At that stage, you usually cannot practice much speaking or listening. But if you have already reached an intermediate level in the other language, you can engage in activities that are different from the ones I just mentioned. For instance, you can do much more speaking, read books, and listen to podcasts. This all makes your learning less monotonous. You can now have a much more interesting and engaging study session. And this is important if you're going to devote at least 1.5 hours per day to language learning. My fifth piece of advice would be the following. Start your study session with the most difficult language of the two. I got this idea from Luca. In one of his videos, he says that he'd always start with Chinese and then continue with Portuguese. Beginning with the most difficult task is usually a good advice for life. When you complete that challenging chore you set yourself up for, you'll be filled with energy and motivation to continue working. If you leave the demanding job to the end of the day, though, you're more likely to procrastinate because you may not have the necessary energy to do it. As Brian Tracy would say, start off by eating that frog. I would argue that there is an added benefit to always starting with a difficult language. Namely, you create a habit out of it. And this means that your way of going about language learning will become automatic. You'll not have to ask yourself with which language you're going to begin with every time you start your study session. You're just going to choose the difficult one by default. That is, you're not wasting mental energy making that decision, creating the so-called decision fatigue, which is something you'd preferably avoid. Having clear priorities is not something you should only keep in mind at an internal level, but also externally. That is, you need to consider how important language learning is going to be vis-a-vis the other activities you undertake in your life. And I would posit that if you want to persevere for at least 2 years learning 2 languages simultaneously, then you should probably prioritize language learning above anything else. Going back to what I said in my previous video, you want to avoid quitting. For this, you need to maintain your motivation levels, and for that, you need to keep working to show up every day. And for that to happen, you need to prevent things from getting in your way. And the best way of doing that is by knowing that no matter what happens in that day, no matter if you had an accident, if you had to stay 12 hours at the office, or if you broke up with your partner, the only thing you know for sure that you're going to do is to study foreign languages. Well, I might have exaggerated a little bit with the examples, but I think you got the point. Cause let's face how reality is. There will be many days when you'll just have 30 minutes to 1 hour to yourself, if lucky. If you have interfering priorities, then you'll most likely end up using that hour you have available to pursue some other activity. In those occasions where you have to choose between staying at home studying Korean or going to the gym and doing some Romanian deadlifts and some Bulgarian split squats, then if not missing leg day is more important to you than studying the language of Psy, then you'll end up opting for the latter. Thus, make language learning your #1 priority to make sure that you leave those Balkan exercises for another day. Alright, that was it for today. I hope you found the video helpful. Hit that bell button so that you don't miss any of my weekly uploads, and see you soon.